So section 3 is really our description of the intervention. And what you want to go into this section under the assumption is that you have a qualified person, like a BCBA, a behavioral consultant that has a lot of foundation in behavior analysis. But let's say that they just got hired on a Friday and you need them to deliver this training on Monday. So you want to be able to provide them even a brief overview of the literature supporting your function-based intervention. And if you keep that in mind, you'll be able to craft this section so that it is targeted at the right jargon level, which is to a professional who's qualified to deliver this training. But at the same time, it'll be a brief reminder, just like any of us should have a brief review of the literature before we provide any training. This section also includes, as we always do, or as we often do, have sections that are already written. As always, you can contact your instructor if you want to shift that material. We always assume that it could be improved upon. But we do want to make sure that you consider the purpose of all of the materials that are already there. So let's break it down into the different subsections. So first of all, you want to give an overview of what a function-based intervention is before you go into your specific function-based intervention. You want to make sure that they understand the foundation of a function-based intervention. That is, that we identify the function of behavior first. And it should be clear that we're confident about the function, that our hypothesis about the function of behavior is well supported. Now, we know in real life, often a behavior can serve different functions in different settings or situations, or that a behavior can serve multiple functions. I'd love for you to do a training project on all the functions, but I don't want to distract from the other work you have to do in this course. The readings are really critical for your skill development as a supervisor. And really to grow as a behavior analyst as well. So we're restricting it here to just the one function your group has. But the overview should be just about function-based interventions. Then you introduce your specific function-based intervention. And these might change from semester to semester. In the semester I'm making this video that we're going into, your function-based intervention is going to be either differential reinforcement or non-contingent reinforcement. And so you want to provide a literature review on that. So I'm going to talk about some of the differences between each of these, although you should assume a solid literature review that identifies all the key components for each of these function-based interventions. So for DR, no, you don't have to develop a literature review for every form of DR. You're only going to train on one form of DR, but you're going to want to make sure you think through what form of DR you're going to use, because in the end, you're going to have to connect this to some other material in the training manual and in section 5, those training materials. So you want to pick a form of differential reinforcement that matches some of the behaviors you say that you're going to target. So you might want to scan through section 4 before you make a final decision on what type of DR you want to do the literature review for. In this section, you do want to be highly technical. This is where you demonstrate the behavioral principles explaining the effectiveness of your function-based procedure. So in this case, a function-based differential reinforcement procedure. You're not going to focus on other functions or other forms of DR, but you do want to make sure that you focus on not just reinforcement, but motivating operations. You're also going to want to talk about the fact that extinction is often included in DR, but it is not always, and why you might make the decision to either include or exclude extinction as part of your differential reinforcement procedure. You also want to make sure that you're including how to thin schedules of reinforcement and connecting that to differential reinforcement, and also the literature on how to fade prompts, because if you're doing DR, you're almost certainly using prompts, right? And so you need to know how to fade those prompts. And training somebody to do an intervention isn't just, this is procedurally how you do this. It's also, this is how you gradually remove the intervention, both by thinning schedules of reinforcement and fading prompts. All right, in this section, remember this is the literature review section, you also, like you always do with the literature, you have to acknowledge the limitations of the specific type of DR that you're using. And so it could be the mismatch between the literature and the situation you're in. So maybe the research was done at a university and you're in a school. Maybe it's the experimenters were advanced graduate assistants and your direct care staff may have just worked in at the Gap or a pizza joint. And so those are very different people. In research, often the experimenter has one and only one thing to focus on, whereas we know, if you've been a direct care staff member, you know that there are often many competing demands, and that's very different than what experimenters face. How many resources are available? In research, you have all the resources available, or you wouldn't have proposed the study that way. In real life, you don't always have all the resources accessible that you might need. And then how different are the research participants from your clients? So, for example, are they different in terms of what skill sets they have? Are they different in terms of their racial or ethnic background, in terms of religious affiliation? What about the sexual diversity of your clients, or what socioeconomic status do they have? Do they have the exact same target behavior as was addressed in the literature? Do they have the same skill sets, same diagnosis, same problem behaviors? So when you do your literature review, you're going to need a minimum of 3 articles, but just like we talked about in section 2, that's the bare minimum, and that's only if you can find support for all of these things I'm talking about in just 3 articles. So you might need to have more than that. Before we move on, I do want to say for whichever your function-based intervention is, you have to be able to explain the benefits and the practical application of your function-based intervention. So, for example, is it easy to implement? Is it expensive? Is it inexpensive? Can you use it with more than one client simultaneously? Is it something that can easily transfer across settings? So, for example, if it's school-based, can you use it out on the playground? Can you use it in the library? Can you use it on the school bus? And so those are the kind of things you're going to want to include at the end of this literature review. With non-contingent reinforcement, you're mostly covering those exact same things. The only thing I will tell you is to make sure, like I said, you're going to focus on that thinning schedule of reinforcement. With non-contingent reinforcement, you are not delivering prompts, right? And so you don't need to focus on prompt fading, but there may be some other things you need to focus on. So, for example, what about motivating operations? I see a lot of people talk about reinforcement as non-contingent reinforcement, and they completely leave out the role of motivating operations. Also, what role can behavioral momentum potentially play with non-contingent reinforcement? This might be you might really want to consider this as part of the behavioral mechanism as well. As a reminder, behavioral momentum is not the same thing as a high probability command sequence. If you've been taught that, those high probability command sequences take advantage of behavioral momentum. They are not equivalent. So you want to make sure that you understand what behavioral momentum is. As you decide whether to include that, whether you can find literature supporting the inclusion of that as a behavioral mechanism for the effectiveness of non-contingent reinforcement. Outside of that, you're mostly going to focus on the same things. How different are the experimenters, the setting, the participants, the resources? What about the practical applications? What about the benefits? And of course, there's a minimum of 3 articles if you're doing non-contingent reinforcement, but that's never enough if you include information there that isn't adequately referenced and sourced in your document. As I've said in other sections, all of these sections need to refer back to either the Professional and Ethical Compliance Code or the Task List 5. Just to, again, help you make the connections. As a supervisor, you constantly have to be making connections between things that you've previously thought of as separate. And so part of the training project is to help you learn how all of these things are integrated and how to actively look to do that activity. So that's a great reason that we include that. The last part of this section is, from my perspective, one of the hardest to do in the entire training project. So don't you dare just leave it to the one person or two people that you assign to write up this section. The only way to do this section and to really be qualified as a supervisor is to be able to craft this section. So how do we choose between differential reinforcement and non-contingent reinforcement? How do we differentiate between these two function-based interventions? So again, you're still only focusing on the same function. If you have the escape function, it's non-contingent reinforcement for escape-maintained behavior versus differential reinforcement for escape-maintained behavior. All right, so how do we choose between these? Obviously, there's literature that can help us make the decision. We should be using research as a big part of our decision making. The function's the same, so it could be equally relevant there. What about the benefits and practical applications that you wrote in previous sections? Yeah, go back and reference that and think about those pieces, because here's the thing. We give you some readings this semester, the Wilczynski article, Wilczynski et al. Article, and the Dennison et al. Article, that can help you understand some cultural variables. I've also, in the comments here, given you a video you can watch. I think it's like an hour and a half. I can't remember exactly. But if you're still challenged with this section, that video might help. And of course, my book, A Practical Guide to Finding Treatments That Work for People with Autism, can be, if you've used that book in other courses, by all means, grab it, review it, and think about it in terms of how does this help you choose between different function-based interventions. So I just do want to remind you, though, this is the literature review for the trainer. You are not going to train your direct care staff on this section. I do think it's important to consider including reference to how these decisions are made. Who makes this decision? And how do they make this decision kind of broadly? Like, we look to research. We look at things like client preferences. We look at things like what resources are available. We look at the treatment acceptability of each intervention to the client, to the caregivers, to the teacher if it's in a school. There are a whole host of things that you can find in the Dennison article, the Wilczynski article, or the book, A Practical Guide to Finding Treatments That Work for People with Autism. All right, that's it for section 3. It's a short video, but it's an awful lot of work, so please reach out to your instructor. We're here to help you.